Good evening, and welcome to the first pop-up lecture of the 2025 spring season of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series. Part of our fourth season and our 16th lecture in total. Thank you all for coming. My name is John Carlton, and I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and the co-organizer of this lecture series. As always, I want to give a big thanks to Paul Sawyer Public Library for hosting us, and to my co-organizer Diane Dahoney, Adult Services Librarian, for everything she and her staff do for these lectures and the community. And many thanks to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for taping these lectures and hosting them on their YouTube channel, and to the State Journal for always giving us some great additional publicity. I'd like to remind everyone that you can find flyers with the full 2025 spring season of the lecture series printed in the back, and you can find the schedule on the library's website and videos of past lectures on Cable 10's YouTube channel. If you're not already, but want to keep up with the lecture series, be sure to follow the library's Facebook page. And we're all excited for our speaker today. Not only is he an acclaimed historian across Kentucky, he's a warm and welcome face around Frankfort to all who know or meet him. Most anyone who has been to the Kentucky Historical Society in the last decade or more has gotten to know Stuart or has seen him at any of KHS's events. And that is where I first met Stuart in the summer of 2020. And I, like so many other of the staff at KHS and at most local museums in general, Stuart got to play an important role in my family history, as he and his staff get to do so every day to others. So I just want to share this brief story of my first encounter with Stuart. In the summer of 2020, Stuart and Greg Hardison started a behind-the-scenes tour of the History Center storage rooms, and I went to the very first one of those tours. On the tour, Stuart and Greg brought out a doll donated around 1946 by my grandmother's aunt. The doll was made in the likeness of my fourth great-grandmother, Maria Holton Leckett, and which had been brought from New Orleans in 1878 by Captain John W. Cannon aboard the famous Robert E. Lee steamboat. And I promise this will actually all come back around full circle. At the moment Greg handed me the doll, I realized I was the first person in my family to have touched that doll since about 1945, but that it was made in the likeness of my fourth great-grandmother, who was born in 1792 to her parents, which were my family's first immigrants to Frankfort in 1785. Yep, I teared up and couldn't believe what I had in my hands connected me across 235 years of my family, before Frankfort was founded and before Kentucky became a state. And then later, Stuart hooked me up with another KHS staff member so I could schedule a day for my family to come to a special room at KHS, and they would pull out all of the artifacts related to my family for us to see at one time. We did that, and I was able to arrange for about 25 members of my family to come. My grandmother's youngest sister was still alive, and that day meant the world to her, her children, and her nephews and nieces. So Stuart got to play a big part in that. And then among the many Frankfort events, Stuart got to represent KHS at the 250th anniversary of Hancock Taylor's first survey of Frankfort in 2023. If everyone knows what's called the Frankfort Cornerstone that sits at the corner of Ann Street and Main Street, it was installed to commemorate that first survey in 1773. The first survey of 1773. The Kentucky Historical Society played a role in its original installment in 1886 at Frankfort's centennial celebration, and again at its rededication in 1899, and KHS finally helped to have the current replica made in 1986 after it mysteriously tumbled in the Kentucky River around 1974. So it was certainly fitting that KHS played a role in the 250th anniversary of the survey, and Stuart, as the lead historian at KHS, got to represent the agency. Stuart was actually one of the first people I reached out to as a speaker for the lecture series in the fall of 2023 when his latest book, Anatomy of a Duel, was just coming out. Unfortunately, timing issues have prevented his appearance until tonight, so we're very glad to have him. If you haven't read it yet, Stuart's book has some Frankfort characters, a ton of Kentucky characters. It is not just about history, but as its name suggests, also about the long and evolving culture of the duel in America and Kentucky. In a possible example of serendipity, one of the stories in Stuart's book involves two first cousins of my fourth great-grandmother, of whom the doll was made. Ezekiel Fenwick and Dr. Walter Fenwick, the latter of whom was killed in a duel in Missouri by Thomas Crittenden, the brother of Governor John J. Crittenden, after Dr. Fenwick's brother failed to show for his own duel. With the duel possibly as an influence, Thomas Crittenden later was appointed Secretary of State to Governor Stonehammer Metcalfe, and showing how small the world was back then, and kind of how small it is today. My fourth great grandmother's brother, Steamboat Captain John Alexander Holden, allegedly brought cholera back to Frankfort via a man aboard one of his steamboats, which then spread and killed Governor Metcalfe, according to the Army Corps of Engineers. So, yeah, it all comes back around, and it's all connected in some way. So it's just really interesting, and I thought that was a fitting intro. But I do want to, before we bring Stuart up, I do want to let you all know that we have some upcoming lectures. March 8th is the Commonwealth Castle from another one of KHS's legends, Nikki Hughes, who started the Kentucky Military Museum, which is the old state arsenal, and that's what his lecture is going to be on. And then we have on March 13th at 6 p.m., Dr. Patrick Lewis, who is the, I guess, counterpart to Stuart at the Filson Historical Society, and he's going to be doing part 2 of the history of the Filson. We had part 1 in December, and that's March 13th at 6 p.m. And then, of course, if you have not already, Russ Hatter's new book, it's called Russ Hatter's Franklin County Reference. It was a publication by the Capital City Museum. Franklin County's first Franklin County only book was just released yesterday, and we will be having Russ to talk about that book on March 18th at 6 p.m. So I invite you all to come out, and without further ado, please welcome Diane Mahoney, Adult Services Librarian, to introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, John.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. Please excuse my croaky voice. I'll be brief here. As John said, my name is Diane Downey. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at Paul Sawyer. And on behalf of our staff here, we just want to thank you for coming out and spending this Thursday evening with us. We're very happy to have Stuart with us, and we've been looking forward to this presentation. Stuart Sanders is the Director of Research and Publications at the Kentucky Historical Society, where he oversees the agency's library, the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, the Historical Markers Program, the America 250 KY Commission, and the Civil War Governors of Kentucky Digital Documentary Edition. Before coming to KHS, Stuart worked to preserve and interpret Kentucky's largest Civil War battleground as the Executive Director of the Perryville Battlefield Preservation Association. He has served a number of roles at KHS, including managing KHS's outreach efforts, administering multiple statewide commissions, and communicating the relevance and value of Kentucky history. He is the author of 5 books and has been a staff member there since 2005. And today he's going to be discussing his book, Anatomy of a Duel, Secession, Civil War, and the Evolution of Kentucky Violence. Please welcome Stuart Sanders.
Well, thanks to John and Diane both for having me, and thank you for the kind introduction. I really appreciate it. And as Diane mentioned, tonight I'll be speaking about my latest book, Anatomy of a Duel. And this book really examines the secession crisis, the Civil War, and how violence evolved in Kentucky in the years after the Civil War, sort of through the lens of a duel that was fought in 1862 between a Union colonel and a pro-Confederate civilian. Now, in May of 1862, Union Colonel Leonidas Metcalfe, who's pictured here on your right, left a hotel in Maysville, Kentucky after giving a speech at a political meeting. And Metcalfe was the son of Kentucky Governor Thomas Metcalfe, and he was an early proponent of unionism during the Civil War, was a staunch unionist early in the conflict. He was a Mexican War veteran, was sort of seen having a wiry frame, just being very tough. And one person said he was a man with whom you would not wantonly want to trifle. So he had a very tough reputation at the time. And as he left this political meeting in Maysville, a man came up to him and handed him a note. Metcalfe opened up the note, and it read, "Sir, having done me great wrong under circumstances accompanying indignity with outrage, you cannot refuse that which is the object of this note to demand, the satisfaction due from one gentleman to another. My friend, Mr. Isaac Nelson, is authorized to arrange the terms of our meeting." And it was signed, quote, "Very respectfully, W.T. Casto." Now, Metcalfe didn't recognize the name William Casto, but he would remember Casto for the rest of his life, because just a few days after this note was passed, he and Casto would fight a duel outside of Maysville using rifles at 60 yards. And he would certainly remember Casto for the remainder of his life. So how did this duel come about, and why, when the Civil War was raging and Americans were killing one another in droves on battlefields across the nation, why did these two men, one a Union colonel, the other a pro-Confederate civilian, fight their own battle on the dueling ground? And really the answer lies in the Union wartime arrests of Southern and secessionist civilians in Kentucky. And in September of 1862, Union authorities in the state really working to consolidate their power by any means necessary. And one way they did this was by arresting pro-Confederate civilians and sending them off to prison camps in the North. And so in addition to arresting newspaper editors and telegraph operators and some more kind of low-level politicians, Union authorities also worked to quell secessionist sympathies, again, by seizing these prominent pro-Confederate residents across Kentucky and shipping them off to northern prisons. And in a lot of instances, this was really, think of it like a Civil War version of the Scared Straight program. They were sort of arrested these men to try to terrify them into submission, to sort of scare the Confederacy out of them in a sense. And these men were sent to places like Camp Chase in Ohio, or Fort Warren in Boston Harbor, or Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor, which is pictured here. So again, these were pretty, for a Kentuckian in 1862, were far away, dank prisons where they were completely cut off from any communication with friends or loved ones. And Union authorities really had no intention of keeping these men. They were typically held for several months in just miserable conditions. Places like Fort Lafayette, the walls seethed with moisture. They would flood sometimes. The food they ate was, undercooked. Pork, for example. They slept on, sort of a pile of straw in a corner of a room with a number of other men. So, they intentionally kept these men in terrible conditions, and then offered them the chance to take a Union oath of allegiance to be released if they took that oath, which would mean they agreed not to support the Confederacy, they would not travel to Confederate states, and they would not aid or abet anyone who supported the Southern Confederacy, and many did. And so while in a lot of instances they were arresting sort of, again, more minor people, there were a few times that Union authorities really arrested more prominent secessionists. And pictured here is James B. Clay, the son of Henry Clay, and he was arrested by Union authorities while supposedly traveling south to join the Confederate Army. He was captured with a number of other men. He was armed, and when Union soldiers grabbed him, they clapped him in chains, paraded him through Lexington, his hometown, to essentially show pro-Confederates there, look, if we can seize the son of Henry Clay, Kentucky's most prominent 19th century politician, we can grab anyone. He was taken to a Union recruiting camp, was sort of roughed up, but he managed to escape kind of their clutches because a judge in Louisville let him pay a $10,000 bond, and he was released, much to the chagrin of federal authorities who wanted to see him taken far away from Kentucky and put into a Union prison. Other prominent politicians were nabbed by Union authorities. Former Kentucky Governor Charles S. Moorhead, who I believe was he was from Nelson County, but he practiced law here in Frankfort for a long time. He was actually arrested for supposedly supporting the Confederacy as well. And he was sort of what was called a white feather unionist, one person called him, saying that he supported the Union when it suited him and when he was able to sort of gain politically. But he was actually seized because he didn't really declare allegiance to one side or the other. And one reason of that, he lived in Kentucky, a border state, but he owned a large plantation in Mississippi and had, several hundred enslaved African Americans there. And it was said that if he took the Union loyalty oath, that he would lose that plantation, would be confiscated by the Confederate government. So that's one reason he never made a Union loyalty oath. He finally did, was released from prison, and he actually fled to Canada, where he remained for the rest of the war. How many of you all were here for the presentation by the man who wrote the book on the founding of the Filson Historical Society? Were any of you here for that? There are a few. Great. So the folks of that book was Reuben Durrett, who was sort of one of the founders of the Filson Club after the Civil War. And Durrett was actually among the men who were arrested during this period in early 1862. He was seized because at the time he was the editor of the Louisville Courier, and which is a newspaper, sort of a pro-Confederate newspaper in Louisville. And it was claimed that he was writing pro-Southern editorials. And the Lincoln administration started getting a lot of letters complaining about his editorials, saying, why are we sending our sons off to fight traitors when this traitor is sitting in Louisville writing these editorials? So he was actually, was seized, was sent to Fort Lafayette, again, here, and was in prison for several months. It was said his wife had a nervous breakdown, and finally he was released as well after taking the Union loyalty oath at that time. So Union Colonel Leonidas Metcalfe, who again ultimately dueled William Casto with rifles at 60 yards in May of 1862, took part in a number of these arrests, and this is how the duel happened. On October 2nd, 1861, Union General William Bull Nelson, who's pictured here, ordered Colonel Metcalfe to arrest 7 secessionists in Maysville, including William T. Casto. And Casto, sort of why arrest Casto? But first of all, Nelson did this. He wanted to protect his rear flank. He was leading a command of Union soldiers down into eastern Kentucky to clear that area out of rebels. So he wanted to sort of make sure that Maysville, his base of operation, was clear of pro-Confederate civilians. So he ended up arresting Casto and a number of other people. But why arrest Casto? He was a grocer's son. He was a well-off attorney, and he had been mayor of Maysville for a time. But even though he was a well-off attorney, he really didn't work. He had inherited a lot of money from his father, and one local wag said that he spent more time at the bar of the local tavern than he did the bar of the courthouse. So he didn't really practice that much. He spent more of his time having a good time instead. But it was said, he was a man of leisure, and when when Union soldiers came to town, it was said he argued with a number of officers, including William Bull Nelson here. And Nelson stood, 6'4", 6'5", weighed well over 300 pounds, had this irascible, angry temper. And so I think when Casto argued with him, it sort of put a bullseye on Casto's chest, and he was arrested. Other men who were arrested by Metcalfe in October of 1862 included a former U.S. congressman named Richard Stanton, whom Bull Nelson called the very soul of the rebellion in this part of Kentucky. He also arrested businessmen, a newspaper editor, and other prominent Maysville figures who were seen to have been supporting the Confederacy. So again, they didn't care this was a former congressman who was arrested. They didn't care that Casto was former mayor. They seized them because of their secessionist sympathies. And Colonel Metcalfe led these troops that arrested these men, including Metcalfe at the time. All the men were eventually imprisoned in Fort Warren and Boston Harbor, and a number of them ended up also in Fort Lafayette, which I showed you earlier. Again, Union authorities had no intention of keeping these men. Instead, they wanted to scare them, sort of force them into taking the Union loyalty oath and sending them home. So after sitting in the dank prisons of Fort Lafayette for several months, most of the Maysville men ended up taking that Union loyalty oath, pledged they wouldn't support the Confederacy, and they were released. But Casto, who is pictured here on your left, again, the secessionist civilian who was arrested by Maysville, he refused to take the Union loyalty oath. As an attorney, he claimed he'd done nothing wrong. He said his constitutional rights had been violated. He demanded a trial. He said, I refuse to take that Union loyalty oath. You're going to hold me here in this prison until you give me my due rights and give me justice. So while other Maysville secessionists went home after taking the oath, he essentially sat in this prison and brooded and sort of thought about how he would take revenge upon the men who had sort of impugned his honor by arresting him. Finally, however, his refusal to take the Union loyalty oath frustrated authorities. They couldn't get rid of him. They were tired of sort of dealing with correspondence about him demanding a trial, and they eventually kicked him out of the prison and did not make him take the Union loyalty oath. So he sort of won his own small little victory, and he immediately went back to Maysville, and then he immediately began practicing with pistols and rifles, preparing for a duel. And he wanted to take revenge on the first person he could find who'd been involved with his arrest. And that person happened to be Colonel Metcalfe, again, who had led the troops who had arrested him. And since Metcalfe was the son of a governor, he was an upper-class Kentuckian, he was well regarded, he was seen as a man of honor, Casto would not simply shoot Metcalfe on the street and murder him, which happened a lot after the Civil War in Kentucky, as we know. Instead, he challenged him to a duel, since both men were gentlemen, and that's when Metcalfe got that note after giving that speech. So when Metcalfe received this note, this challenge to duel Casto, he really had no memory of arresting Casto specifically, but Metcalfe had made a name for himself as a staunch Unionist, and he, even though some people said, look, you don't have to duel, Casto has no grounds for sort of challenging you to this fight, Metcalfe said, look, I refuse to be browbeaten, he said, and he recognized that as a prominent Unionist in the area, he sort of had to defend himself, he believed, and he said, if I refuse this duel, other people are going to continually challenge me to duel to try to improve their own reputations, and they'll try to kill me on the dueling ground. So he decided to sort of nip it in the bud and fight this duel with William Casto. So this duel really, at the time, played into Kentucky's own brand of honor culture, as we call it. So what is honor, and how did it push people like Casto and Metcalfe to the dueling ground? So most duels, as we know, had their roots in the Southern Code of Honor. And to simplify it, the Code of Honor was really unwritten rules of behavior that regulated how you acted, but more importantly, how your community viewed you. Above all, those who followed this Code of Honor wanted to avoid shame and embarrassment above all else. So if, for example, someone from the same social class cheated you or embarrassed you or insulted you, you might issue a challenge to duel in order to protect your reputation, to show that you were not going to stand there and be insulted and sort of have your honor impugned. Otherwise, your friends and neighbors might shun you. You might be treated as sort of no longer a gentleman. It could hurt your business interests. It could hurt your broader family and their reputation. And so that's one reason a number of these Southerners during the 19th century ended up finding their ways to the dueling ground. So again, when honor was maligned, I mentioned failed business duels, insults, political squabbles. An editorial may have been written about you, condemning you in the local press. You may challenge the editor to duel after that. These blue-blooded Kentuckians sort of saw this as a logical form of conflict resolution and believed they could solve this affront by fighting sort of a formal, structured duel. And we do know that many prominent Kentuckians, including Henry Clay, Robert Wycliffe, Cassius Marcellus Clay, John Rowan, and many others, all fought duels in order to maintain their reputations. And so among these, sort of gentlemen at the time, their personal reputations outweighed any potential legal consequences that they might face that were really meant to curtail dueling. And Kentucky laws against dueling were proposed as early as 1799, and anyone who's convicted of giving a challenge to duel or accepting a challenge or fighting a duel was actually banned from holding any state office for 7 years. And furthermore, all public officials, from lawyers, legislators, the governor, and more, all had to swear an oath that they had never, challenged anyone to duel or fought a duel or acted as a second, which is sort of your helper during the duel. And this oath became part of the 1849 Constitution, and it's still in use today. Some of you may have heard that or even taken it. Are there any attorneys in the audience at all? So yeah, I know board members of the Kentucky Historical Society have to take it. If you're on the library board here, you have to take it. But you solemnly swear that I have not, fought a duel or engaged. It goes on, and it usually gets a chuckle from the audience because it just sounds crazy. And I'm glad it's in there because it's a sort of fun piece of Kentucky history. But it was put in the Constitution in 1849 because they thought that sort of a hot-headed gentleman's desire for political office would outweigh their desire to duel. And so they hoped that this would sort of prevent people from dueling. It really didn't. A lot of Kentuckians still dueled despite that. But again, if a lawyer dueled, they could potentially lose their law license. And that's, but again, you could also be imprisoned or get fines against you as well. But again, these laws really didn't dissuade upper-class Kentuckians from dueling. And when men like Henry Clay fought duels, it sort of placed a societal stamp on approval and led everyone to think, okay, well, if somebody like Henry Clay is doing this, then trying to shoot your enemy must be fine, So again, it sort of placed a societal and cultural stamp of approval on it, despite any laws. Also, courts rarely prosecuted duelists. A lot of times the prosecutors were sort of pro-dueling, or at least it made sense to them. Yeah, sure, if your reputation's harmed by another gentleman, it's perfectly logical for you to go out and shoot at one another from 30 feet away. And again, it became a way for people to resolve these personal difficulties. And some historians even think that dueling may have become more popular because of laws that forbade the practice. Noted Kentucky jurist John Rowan, he lived in what is now known as my old Kentucky home, a very prominent Kentuckian, fought his own duels, and he actually wrote, quote, "The effect of anti-dueling legislation led to it to be increased tenfold." So again, people thought that laws against it and forbidding the practice sort of drove people to the dueling ground. And actually in Kentucky, kind of the lax response that the Kentucky legal system had toward not only dueling, but also murder in general during this time was well known. This prompted one out-of-state duelist to say about his future opponent, quote, "I wish I had him in Kentucky that I might kill the dog without the trouble of fighting him." So again, the state's reputation for violence at the time was pretty bad. So again, as I mentioned, some of the gentlemen who dueled included some of our most prominent politicians and citizens. Henry Clay, pictured here, fought 2 duels. And in 1807, Clay was a member of the Kentucky legislature, and he and another legislator named Humphrey Marshall actually argued in the Kentucky House of Representatives. And at the time, 1807, a few years before the War of 1812, tensions were very high with Great Britain. And Henry Clay issued a resolution saying that Kentuckians should only purchase clothes of domestic manufacture. We should not buy anything from Great Britain that we wear. Instead, we should only, because textiles was a major export from Great Britain coming into Kentucky, and he said, look, we should only wear clothes made in Kentucky. And Marshall, who's a former U.S. congressman, called Clay's idea, quote, "the claptrap of a demagogue." And I wish politicians today still use this sort of language, call each other demagogue. Well, anyway, but Clay was insulted. He felt that Marshall's comment had impugned his honor, and by calling him a demagogue, he ended up challenging Humphrey Marshall to duel, and it was fought near Louisville with pistols. And although both men missed twice on the third fire, Marshall shot Clay in the leg, giving Clay a very minor wound. This, of course, was not Clay's only duel. In 1826, when he was United States Secretary of State, he actually fought another duel. A Virginia senator named John Randolph called Clay the cross between the Puritan and the blackleg. Basically called Clay a swindler, and again insulted. Clay challenged Randolph. They fought with pistols outside of Washington, D.C. Both men missed on the first fire, and on the second shot, Clay fired and missed, and he waited for Randolph to essentially take his time and shoot him. But instead, Randolph raised his pistol in the air and fired, deliberately missing Clay. And Clay was sort of overwhelmed by this, magnanimous gesture. The 2 men shook hands and reconciled, eventually became friends. So again, Clay fought 2 duels in office, yet somehow he still became known as the Great Compromiser. So it's a little funny that he certainly didn't find compromise in his own life, even though he tried it as a politician. But again, there were dueling grounds across Kentucky, as I mentioned. Some were fought near Louisville. In a lot of instances, Kentuckians would go across the Ohio River to fight in Indiana to avoid prosecution. But the farm of James K. Duke, right on the Fayette County-Scott County line, it's actually located where the Kentucky Horse Park is now, was a prominent dueling ground. Because again, it was right on that county line between Fayette and Scott counties. And that became a noted place of several duels were fought there. One was the Dudley-Richardson duel, which is where 2 Lexington doctors got in an argument over an autopsy and fought a duel over that. Makes perfect sense. But in that duel, one of the doctors shot the other one in the leg, severed his femoral artery, and then ran in and staunched the flow of blood and saved his opponent's life. And so, if you're going to duel anyone, it's good to duel a doctor in case you get shot. But there were more deadly duels fought there. There were two Transylvania University students who dueled there in 1852, and the weapon of choice were shotguns loaded with slugs, and one of the students actually blew the head off the other one. So duels could be very deadly. They weren't all sort of pointing your pistol in the air or saving your opponent's life. They could be pretty terrible. So there were, again, a number of duels fought on that farm. But by the time of the Civil War, again, as Americans were killing each other by the thousands on battlefields across the nation, really the idea of fighting a formal, structured duel became, somewhat ridiculous and foreign to a lot of Kentuckians. Just a month before Metcalfe and Casto dueled, for example, more than 23,000 men were killed and wounded at the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee. So you have these massive casualties being reported. So again, the idea of two men going out and sort of transforming the dueling ground into their own battlefields, these two men were political antagonists, just seems absolutely ludicrous, but it happened. Again, near Maysville at the time. And Casto, again, the secessionist civilian, really believed that his honor had been damaged when he was unjustly arrested and carted off to a Union prison without trial or any hearing of any sort. And then because of that, he challenged Metcalfe to the duel, thinking that would sort of uphold his reputation as an honorable man. So again, Metcalfe and Casto fought a duel during the Civil War, but there were actually a handful of other duels that were fought between soldiers during the Civil War. And pictured here is Brigadier General George Earl Maney, who led a brigade of soldiers at Perryville in October of 1862. And my second book is actually about his brigade at the Battle of Perryville, sort of a command study of what his troops went through. Several of his regiments suffered about 50% casualties at Perryville. They endured the heaviest fighting. For a Civil War battle, 50% casualties is a monumental number. I mean, typically, a lot of the heavy battles, regiments would lose 13%. I mean, so to think about 50%, it's pretty staggering. But after that battle, there's a Nashville doctor named George Nickel who accused Manny of cowardice. And so Manny just sort of upholds his own honor, being called a coward, but also, to preserve the honor of his regiments from Perryville, he challenged Dr. Nickel to a duel and supposedly wounded him in that fight. But details are pretty scant, because again, he could have been court-martialed or arrested. So in most instances, you want to keep a duel quiet to avoid prosecution. John Marmaduke and Lucius Walker, and this is Marmaduke pictured here, they were both Confederate generals, fought a duel near Little Rock, Arkansas in 1863, after Marmaduke had inferred that Walker was a coward. And tensions had already existed between these two generals, but they essentially settled their difference on the dueling ground. During one battle, one of the generals claimed that the other one's regiments weren't supporting his, and they constantly bickered, and they finally found themselves on the dueling ground fighting with Colt Navy revolvers, which are six guns, at about 15 paces, so basically 45 feet. In the fight, Marmaduke killed Walker, and even though Marmaduke was charged with murder, the charges were eventually dropped, because again, there was a war going on. So of course, it's fine if you killed another general, honor was at stake. So Marmaduke continued his career in the Confederate military. So again, the concept of honor is what drove these men to the field, and this concept really called for duels to be kept dispassionate. That's one reason duels were fought, because if you were a high-toned gentleman, the worst thing you could do is lose your temper, and especially in front of another gentleman. So the idea was you wouldn't even talk to your opponent. Your second, or the man who sort of represented you in the duel, would negotiate the duels and would sort of do all the talking while you were dispassionately sort of separated from the affair, and were sort of kept above the fray until you could aim a pistol at your opponent and try to shoot him dead. So here's how duels typically worked. If you felt that your honor had been maligned, you would have your second, again, a trusted friend who acted as a negotiator, would send that challenge to duel to your adversary. And this is what happened, again, to Metcalfe. One of Casto's friends brought him that challenge to duel, which I thought about. So the challenged party typically got to pick the time, the place of the duel, and weapons to be used. And typically, across the South, pistols at 10 paces, which is about 30 feet, was typically the weapons of choice, but rifles were sometimes used. Knives and swords were also chosen, but this was pretty rare. And actually, believe it or not, Lincoln was challenged to a duel. And when he lived in Illinois, the state auditor of Illinois challenged Lincoln to a duel because there had been a number of newspaper articles written condemning that auditor and sort of making fun of him, and it was sort of Lincoln was suspected of writing these articles, so the auditor challenged Lincoln to duel. So Lincoln, as the challenged party, got to choose the weapons. So if you were challenged, if someone, if Keith Jackson over here, if he challenged me to duel because I insulted him, I would get to pick the time, the place of the duel, and also the weapons to be used. So I could have a little bit of an advantage to it. So Lincoln picked broadswords, and as we know, Lincoln was 6'4", had sort of hewed his strength by chopping wood on the Kentucky, Illinois, and Indiana frontier, chose broadswords. One reason he did that is that the state auditor was a diminutive, small little guy, and when he picked broadswords, the editor or the auditor thought, maybe this is not a very good idea, and sort of managed to back out of the duel. And Lincoln said, well, that's a good idea, because I would have split that man in two. And so one wonders, would Lincoln have been elected president in 1860 had he cleaved the Illinois state auditor in half with a broadsword? One will never know, but he would have gotten more votes in Kentucky probably if he had actually fought a duel during that time. But again, back to Casto and Metcalfe, and their duel in 1862. And again, on May 8th, 1862, just 2 days after the challenge to duel was issued, Casto and Metcalfe fought their duel on an area called the Fishing Shore near Dover, Kentucky, sort of outside of Maysville in Mason County, up on the Ohio River. Metcalfe again accepted this challenge because he said he didn't want to be browbeaten, he didn't want to keep getting challenges, so he decided to fight Casto in this duel. And as one Dover resident put it, mutual friends made an effort to reconcile the political antagonists, but the fight alone could heal the wounded honor of one, which was Casto, and preserve the integrity of the other. So as the challenge party, Metcalfe picked rifles at 60 yards. Interestingly enough, his father, Kentucky Governor Stonehammer Metcalfe, had fought a duel when he was a member of U.S. Congress, and he had also chosen rifles at that time. When Metcalfe picked rifles, Casto's negotiators initially balked at that idea. They eventually settled on Colt revolving rifles loaded with one round at 60 yards. The Colt revolving rifle looked like that right there. That's a picture from the Library of Congress showing a soldier who used one. And although the men had tried to keep the duel a secret, again, dueling was illegal. Colonel Metcalfe could have been court-martialed for fighting the duel. Even though they wanted to keep the duel secret, a crowd of actually hundreds of people showed up for this duel. And when both men arrived on the dueling ground, Casto came down the Ohio River from Maysville on a steamboat. It was said that it was like a party-like atmosphere. People were excited. And as soon as he disembarked onto the shore, he immediately began practicing with his rifle, shooting at targets from 60 yards away. Metcalfe came in a little bit differently. He rode in on a couple of carriages with some buddies. And when he got out of the carriage, instead of practicing, he laid down on the shoreline and took a nap. And at one point, as Casto's rifle was sputtering in the distance, Metcalfe sort of opened up one eye, sat up, got his rifle, and shot the handle off a pocket knife that had been stuck in a log at 60 yards, put the gun down, laid down again on the shore, and took a nap. Now, I used to say, I don't want to ruin the story for anybody. I'm not going to tell you who won the duel. But considering one man could shoot a pocket knife at 60 yards and the other one was practicing, you have a pretty good idea of who won the duel. What happened was when they lined up, the way this duel operated, they flipped a coin to see which second, again, which helper, would do the call to fire. And the way this worked, the men would line up, hold their rifles like this at present arms, and one of the seconds would go ready, and they would aim, and then they'd go fire, 1, 2, 3, and they could shoot at any time during that 3-second time. So they picked who would do the call to fire. Then they picked where they would stand, and Metcalfe won that challenge, and he decided, much against the advice of his seconds, he stood where the sun was actually in his face. And his seconds were like, are you crazy? What are you doing? But again, he was a man of honor. He wanted to keep the duel fair. So he said, look, I know what I'm doing. I'll take the disadvantaged spot, give this guy a fighting chance. So when the duel started, Metcalfe looked at his opponent and said, I'm going to shoot him through the left breast pocket. And so the men lined up. The second said, fire, 1. A shot rang out. Casto fired, and the bullet whizzed harmlessly past Metcalfe's head. Then the Union colonel aimed for a second. The second count went off, and he pulled the trigger, and he did exactly as he said. He shot Casto in the chest. Casto collapsed on the bank of the Ohio River, and within 15 minutes, he was dead. Now, the trip back up the Ohio River in that steamboat with Casto's body was much more melancholy. They took his body back up to Maysville, where he was buried, and the epitaph on his tombstone talks about him defending his own honor at a time of great, tragedy and political turmoil. And when I first saw that, I sort of thought, oh, he wrote this before he died. It was like the perfect thing that he would have wanted on his tombstone. I really think that Casto wrote that because it talks about a man preserving his reputation and honor and that sort of thing. And I think he really wrote it. So Casto dies, sort of fades into obscurity. Metcalfe takes a really interesting turn. He's to me, one of the more compelling figures from Kentucky's Civil War history. Even though he was a slave owner before the war, his views about slavery began to change during the conflict. He started blaming slave owners as being the cause of the Civil War. He supported Abraham Lincoln in the election of 1864. He supported the enlistment of African-American Union soldiers as well. He had a total 180 shift on all these things. And if you know Kentucky Civil War history, the Emancipation Proclamation and the enlistment of black troops in Kentucky angered white Kentuckians, even loyal Unionist Kentuckians, because they believed that slavery would be better protected within the Union than out of it because of fugitive slave laws. Being so close to northern states, enslaved people could cross the Ohio River. In the Union, they had the chance to get those enslaved individuals back because of laws. But if Kentucky left and joined the Confederacy, all those laws would disappear, and any slaves who escaped over the Ohio River would stay in free territory. So a lot of these Kentuckians, even though they supported the Union, they were pro-slavery, and that's why they supported it. So they became extremely angered about Metcalfe sort of blaming slave owners for the law. He said, look, if you look at a enslaver's house, he essentially commented on the biracial children, talking about sexual violence, and that also angered a lot of white Kentuckians who kept those terrible stories about enslavement sort of under the rug and never talked about it. But Metcalfe did. It ruined his reputation in Kentucky. He ended up resigning from the Union Army after the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky, because a regiment of cavalry he led completely fell apart in the face of veteran Confederate troops. He was so angered over his regiments running away that he resigned from the Union service, began writing letters to the editors and giving speeches for the Union condemning slave owners, eventually moved to Cincinnati, where after the war he started a business. He died in 1866, shortly after the war, about age 47. So his life was sort of fairly short after the war. And even though he was seen as sort of a Union hero for killing Casto, for killing this pro-Confederate civilian, again, he sort of ruined his own reputation by supporting what Confederates believed was sort of the unholy trinity in Kentucky. He supported Lincoln, he supported emancipation, and he supported the enlistment of African-American Union soldiers. And that was sort of condemned his reputation among even loyal white Kentuckians during that time. So for me, this duel is important because it's one of the last ones fought in Kentucky under that formal code. We do know there were a handful of other duels fought in Kentucky after the Civil War. In 1866, for example, I mentioned that dueling ground where the Transylvania University students, one killed another in Fayette, at what is now the Horse Park. A former Union sergeant fought a duel with a former Confederate officer on that dueling ground using Henry Clay's dueling pistols in 1866. It was not a political duel. The two men had hated each other when they were growing up. They just happened to go different ways. They got in a fist fight at a tavern in Paris, even though they'd both been terribly wounded at the Battle of Chickamauga. One had a shattered leg, the other had a shattered arm. They still got in a fist fight. One man picked up a chair and ended the fight by hitting his opponent. That led to a challenge to duel. And in that fight, the Confederate officer ended up shooting the former Union sergeant through the hips. And he'd already been wounded in the leg at Chickamauga. It was a terrible wound. He survived, spent the rest of his life living in Union veteran homes across the nation, including California. Died, his body was returned to Cynthiana where he was buried. The Confederate officer and his second ended up fleeing to Canada to avoid prosecution, and they stayed there for 10 years. And finally, a Kentucky governor who's also a former Confederate ended up giving them a pardon. They came back. When he became a noted horse breeder, and when he died, he was also buried in Cynthiana. So these two guys can't get away from each other now, even though they hated one another just both before and after the Civil War. And so that was one of the final duels fought in Kentucky. So even though the duel between Casto and Metcalfe wasn't the last duel fought in Kentucky, to me it represents an important pivot point that shows how really the application of violence changed in Kentucky after the war. So after the Civil War, they abandoned sort of formal dueling, but the pretense of honor still remained. So, in 1860, if Keith insulted me, I would challenge him to a duel. But by 1868, 1870s, 1880s, when Kentuckians were all running around with concealed weapons, if Keith insulted me, instead of challenging him to a duel, I would simply pull my pistol out and shoot him. And in most instances, if he had a pistol on him, which he probably would have because he was a man of means in Kentucky in 1870, the courts would say it was self-defense. And so they rarely prosecuted all these murders that were committed by upper-class Kentuckians. And with the decline of the duel, one Southerner lamented, he said, quote, "But now the silver-mounted smoothbore dueling pistols have given way to the rifle-barrel revolvers, and quick snap shooting on the street has superseded the old-fashioned duel at 10 paces. The formality of a challenge is now out of fashion, and the hip pocket pistol is now inserted in every man's trousers. Both methods are barbarous, but I'm inclined to think that the old-time method was the least barbarous, as it gave one time to make his will and hope for an apology." So, again, some people liked the idea of dueling because they felt that it was that formal. So, as the staggering number of shootouts occurred between well-heeled Kentuckians in the decades after the Civil War, Kentucky's reputation began to plummet. Feuding in areas of eastern Kentucky, political fights, murders on election day. I mean, if you open up a newspaper between 1870 and 1900, you'll find a murder like that. Like it's really crazy and pretty sad actually too. There's here in town, for example, there's a judge, John Milton Elliott, who was murdered near what is now the Capital City Museum on Ann Street by a man who was mentally ill. He was also from a prominent family. He walked up, said, "Judge, how about we do some snipe hunting?" And he killed him with a shotgun. In that murder that happened, there was a journalist who came through town and asked a local resident about it who'd never heard. And the resident said, "Well, if it's not a brother or a father, we really don't worry about it much," because they were just so used to killings that happened that it was just like another day in Frankfort at the time. People just got sort of used to this type of violence. And one terrible story, in 1887, there were two Republican Party operatives, one Armistead Swope was the name of one, and William Cassius Goodloe was the other. Again, both prominent men in the Republican Party in Kentucky. They hated one another. This was 1889. And as luck would have it, they both went to the post office at the same time. And as luck would have it even more, one man's post office box was right above the other one's. Of course it was. And so one guy was getting his mail. The other one comes up, says, "Get out of my way. I'm getting my mail." "You get out of my way." "No, you get out." And they started arguing. One man had a pistol. The other had a knife. They both drew their weapons, got locked in arm in arm, swirling around the Lexington post office, one shooting, the other stabbing. William Cassius Goodloe carried the knife. Swope had a pistol. Swope was stabbed 13 times. Goodloe was shot in the stomach. Both men ended up dying as a result of that fight. Made headlines across the nation. Kentucky's reputation continued to plummet. By 1890, Kentucky was no longer seen as being the home of erudite leaders like Henry Clay. It was not the land of great compromise. Instead, it was a place where murders happened on a terrifying basis, and the state's reputation as a lawless place was further damaged in 1900 when Governor Goebel was assassinated at what is now the old state capitol here in Frankfort. So in my latest book, Anatomy of a Duel, I really examined the secession crisis and how violence changed in the state through the lens of the Casto-Metcalfe duel. And for me, it provides, again, that pivot point for when dueling fell out of fashion, but Southern honor remained alive in the state among upper-class Kentuckians, and they sort of exercised that honor culture by carelessly shooting one another on the street. So appreciate you all having me. Unfortunately, I only have a couple copies of the book here for sale tonight, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you all might have about the fun topic of violence in Kentucky. So thank you, appreciate it. Okay. Okay, and I can repeat too.
On TV.
Sure. I think she's going to grab a mic so they can hear the questions on TV. So, 1 second, please. No, it's okay. I'll sing you a song while we. I'll tell you another terrible story of violence in the state. Yeah, my dad taught history at Washington Lee University in Lexington, Virginia, and he found a story. There was a Kentuckian who was in town late 1800s, had moved to Lexington, Virginia, and was going to the courthouse to do some business at the county courthouse. And two Virginians come out of the courthouse and they're screaming at each other and arguing. So he thought, uh-oh, and he dove behind a bush and hid. He sort of sat there waiting for gunfire, and he finally looked up and saw the two men shaking hands. And he later wrote, he said, well, if this were in Kentucky, they would have killed each other minutes ago. And he was just shocked by this. So again, unfortunately, that became sort of what Kentucky was known for in the late 1900s. But yes, ma'am, she had a question over here. So.
Two questions, actually. I can probably touch on
Yeah, that's okay. There you go.
Were there ever any duels between women?
That's a great question. So the question was, were there ever any duels between women? There's some reports that there were duels between women in New Orleans. Like, New Orleans is sort of a hotbed for dueling. We don't know if the stories are apocryphal or not. I would guess that there probably were at some point. I don't know how formal they were, but there's even a story of two women in New Orleans fighting with swords. So it's, there's not a lot of information. It would be sort of like, it would run in a 19th century newspaper, like how shocked everyone was that two women would do that. However, they weren't sort of considered upper class women. It was sort of, they were considered kind of more lower class, and there was a little bit of shock that they'd done this and acted in that fashion.
The other question, are there statistics regarding how many people were actually killed versus maimed or
Right.
missed?
Hard to tell. I mean, most duels ended before they were fought, because a lot of times the seconds, again, who are doing these negotiations, I think Richard has a question too, but the seconds would sort of get an apology, basically. Saying, you don't want to duel, this is what he needs to do to apologize. They'd shake hands and apologize. And since duels were illegal, they tried to keep them quiet. They typically weren't talked about. So it's hard to get sort of a real handle on how many duels were actually fought and how many men were actually killed. But we do know, and there were two men who dueled over, one man killed another man's dog, stabbed him here in Frankfort, and there was a duel fought over that. So, Franklin County had their own share of this sort of violence, so, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about those. I know Humphrey Marshall had connections with Frankfort. In fact, where Limewater was
Right.
his home. I know there was a fellow named, I think there was a duel with someone named Holman.
Yeah, it was the Holman Waring duel. That's the one where one of them killed the other man's dog. I think in a parade. I think there was a military parade. John, you may be more familiar with this, but there's a military parade. This dog comes up. This officer in Frankfort, probably a local militia, I may be telling this wrong, but it's been a while since I looked at it, but killed the dog. The two men dueled over the dog. Now, admittedly, I think if a man kills your dog, you probably should be able to duel him, because I love dogs. But, other than that. But yes, there were duels here in Frankfort. Also, there was the newspaper editor, S.I.M. Major. I think he either fought a duel or almost fought a duel. So newspaper editors were constantly trying to shoot one another in Kentucky during the 19th century. Because, the newspapers would argue with each other in the editorial pages. And so Major almost fought a duel. So I talk a lot about Thomas Marshall Green in my book. He was sort of Metcalfe's original second, but he backed out sort of last minute. And I think he was a newspaper editor here at one time, and he and Major almost fought a duel as well. Green is interesting. He was sort of seen, became kind of Kentucky's sort of foremost public intellectual in a sense in the years after the Civil War. And he became a primary negotiator of that fight. He ended up killing a man in 1887 on the streets of Lexington. He had, as a journalist, accused a Nicholasville politician of voter fraud. That's not relevant. Claims of voter fraud aren't relevant today, but he ended up sort of accusing this politician of voter fraud on the day that the John C. Breckinridge statue was dedicated in downtown Lexington, and there was a crowd of thousands of people in town. They saw one another, cursed at one another, and pulled pistols and started shooting, and Green ended up killing that Lou Baldwin, that politician. So several people with Frankfort ties who ended up fighting duels. So, yes, ma'am.
I have kind of a subjective question. Would you consider the reputation that they were defending kind of, since it's like this third party separate thing from themselves, would you consider the attack to have been more like a defacing of their reputation, or like a lethal attack, like a destruction attempt?
Yeah,
Something else.
that's a great question. So that desire to maintain the reputation, like sort of among kind of Southern gentlemen of means, you know, like your reputation was one of the main things that you had. So that honor was, again, how it wasn't only how you viewed yourself, it was also like how your community viewed you. And so you wanted to be seen in the community as being, you know, honest, brave, I mean, essentially honorable. And so if you were challenged and refused to duel, you could potentially be seen as being a coward, which is sort of the worst, you know, thing you could be called. Because again, among these, according to honor studies, historians say that the worst thing Southern men did not want to have sort of shame. So the idea to avoid sort of that public shame was most important. But there's a class difference too. So if I were an upper class Kentuckian and Keith was a lower class Kentuckian, wave Keith. Thank you, sir. He's a buddy of mine, I'm sorry. And if he insulted me, the idea was I would not duel him because we were not social equals. And the code of honor called, instead you deal with it immediately. So I might cane him on the street when I see him. I might horsewhip him. You know, I would sort of immediately sort of take that affront seriously and handle it then and there. So again, if you're dealing with someone from a lower class, that's how you would handle it. And part of that was, like, the whole horsewhipping thing was to equate that lower class person with an enslaved person. So me as a high-toned white Southerner, I'm horsewhipping you. It means I'm also treating you like an enslaved person. So it's like trying to put that lower class person in their place too. So there's this whole, you know, like equal class sort of strictures of honor, but also class differences. It gets really complicated and sort of crazy, but it lasted in Kentucky for a long time. That attitude that you would not, you know, I'm too good to fight you. I'll deal with you now and beat you at the time. So, yes, ma'am.
What happened if the lower class person won?
Oh, if the lower class person won. Yeah, I mean, I think it would bring shame upon you, probably. You know, would be the
They
thing.
were arrested?
Yeah, they would probably be arrested, though, too. Yeah, for sort of putting, you know, in England, I think a lot of this is sort of has roots in England. You know, during the Victorian era, if you put your hands on a gentleman, you got arrested and locked up. I think I'm right on that. At least that's what the BBC, you know, mystery shows say. But I think it is. I mean, I think, like, you got to get your hands off me. I'm a gentleman, and you go to prison for it. So, you know, I think, I mean, and also too, you know, you would have been buddies with all the lawyers, the judges, the prosecutors. They would have locked you in the penitentiary. So, yes, ma'am. These are all great questions. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I don't know. Well, okay. So I wanted to know how violence became less commonplace, like after 1900.
Yeah.
What?
That's a great question. So when and how did violence become less commonplace? I really think there was sort of a cultural shift. Even in the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 1930s, like, violence was pretty bad in Kentucky. I'm working on a project now that is dealing with sort of Prohibition era corruption in Western Kentucky. And that story starts with a murder. Like, people still carried concealed weapons all the time. And I think that sort of cultural shift of not carrying all the time and not being so quick to grab it made a change. I think World War II and the Depression kind of, for some reason, there was a cultural change around that time that, you know, people became less hot-headed. And I think part of it was the justice system probably made improvements too, and more people were getting prosecuted for these crimes. Because again, a lot of times, like, you know, I'm looking, that story starts with a 1923 murder in downtown Lexington. It was a young man who killed an older man, and both had guns on them. And even though, well, the younger man killed he wasn't a policeman, he was sort of a security guard. The young man who basically murdered the security guard got off because the security guard was armed and he wasn't a sworn police officer. You know, he was sort of acting like one. So, you know, court cases would just get thrown out a lot. So I think it ended up being sort of a cultural shift in the state that ended that. And that's something I'm having a hard time sort of pinpointing a time, but I think it tended to be after the 30s. And so I wonder if it wasn't the Depression, people had more things to sort of worry about. But yeah, I mean, violence in Kentucky was pretty terrible at the time. So, yes, ma'am.
So I have two hopefully quick questions.
Sure.
So would you be buried with your weapon if you lost the duel?
Yeah, so the question was, would you be buried with your weapon? Typically not.
Okay.
So in weapons, a lot of upper class Kentuckians would have sort of a set of finely crafted dueling pistols that would be passed down. And also to add to sort of the honor and the formality, a lot of times they would use famous dueling pistols. Like I mentioned, like Henry Clay or Andrew Jackson's pistols would be used and sort of passed around. And so that was seen as being, you were a gentleman if you had your set of dueling pistols.
Okay. My second question, I've only seen a duel on John Wick.
Oh, yeah.
So do you just get one shot, one chance?
It really depended. So they would duel until one of the people said, okay, my honor has been satisfied. So the idea was, since duels, they want to keep them dispassionate, but they also had to be fair. And so you wouldn't duel, for example, an elderly person. You wouldn't duel a person who was sick. You wouldn't duel a child. There are these sort of rules. Also, if Keith and I were dueling, Keith shot me and I was wounded, that meant he had the advantage, so the duel would stop. So as soon as blood was drawn or someone was killed, the duel would stop. So after the first shot, the seconds would go, his honor been satisfied. And sometimes they'd go, yeah, we're done, and they'd stop. And that happened quite a bit. One of my favorite stories is two men exchange the first shot, the seconds go up to talk to one another, and he goes, hey, I think they should just shake hands. The other second said, well, their hands have been shaking this half hour. Because, they were terrified. And Cassius Marcellus Clay, noted abolitionist in Kentucky, emancipationist, he was a noted knife fighter, like defended himself with a Bowie knife a lot, but he fought a couple of duels. And it was said that he could sever a silver chain with a pistol at like 10 feet. And so he was in a duel one time and he missed. And the second comes up, he goes, you can shoot a silver chain. How'd you miss this guy? He said, well, the silver chain never had a damn pistol in its hand. So it was just terrifying, and they missed a lot. And they were smoothbore pistols, they weren't as accurate. So, but yeah, that's a lot of times that's when duels would end. They would just, honor would be satisfied. Sometimes it was much more perfunctory, like they knew that going into it they weren't going to kill each other. And so they'd sort of, aim a little to the right and, would miss. So. Any other questions at all? Yes, sir.
It just occurred to me, talking about this, you said there's a break. It was more in the early days, 1860s circa. It was more of an honor thing.
Yeah.
And as time progressed and towards the 1890s, it became more of a, you've offended me, and I'm flat, everybody carries a pistol.
Right.
So it seems to me that maybe, just throwing it out off the top of my head, that when the South was defeated, that culture of honor and stuff was in demise, perhaps, and going away. And that's where,
to some extent, yeah.
Going away, and it was more now. It's just like free for all.
But part of it, with the lost cause and this idea that the South is put down but will rise again. I mean, I think the Southernness. Kentucky became, seceded after the war, it's always said. I think a lot, that sort of actually spurred a lot of the violence, because it's like, oh, we're actually a Southern state, this is what we do. Like, there's some historians who say that the Southernness of dueling made it more attractive to some people. So I think the idea of like moonlight and magnolias and defending your reputation, for the next two generations of Southerners sort of made a lot of that violence worse. Yes, sir.
Was dueling centered in Kentucky, or did other Southern states?
Yeah, it was all over the South, and really Mississippi had a lot. Mississippians seemed to be more inclined to get insulted pretty quickly. There's one writer who said, my fourth book was on two murders that took place on a steamboat that involved Southern honor in 1856, and I found a quote that said, Mississippians would get insulted if a cat tread on their toe. And so there were a lot of duels in Mississippi. New Orleans, there were a lot too. But one thing I talk about in this book is how Kentuckians exported their own brand of honor culture and dueling into other states, like Missouri in particular. And so John had mentioned that duel in Missouri that was fought between Kentuckians. So a lot of Kentuckians who went there would duel. Also California in the 1850s, there were duels, because Southerners would go there, been there for the gold rush, they became politicians. There were two California legislators who dueled around 1854 even. So, Southerners sort of exported that. Just as Europeans brought dueling here to the United States, Southerners sort of took that same culture westward. As the nation expanded, so did the idea of dueling. But again, it was more rare. I'm not trying to set it up that there were duels all the time. It was sort of a rare occurrence, but It did happen in other states. And again, New Orleans, Mississippi, Deep South was much more prevalent. Yes, sir.
How do you relate dueling as you described it in this presentation with what we've seen with the Westerns and Cowboys?
Great question. Yeah, and I think it has a lot to do with it. I mean, to be honest, I don't think that, that sort of draw is a little bit of a Hollywood fiction in a sense, but it did happen. I mean, there were still formal duels, but the difference was they were using 6-shot pistols. The range was much better for those pistols, but it's that sort of Old West gunfighter style is kind of the idea of, dueling evolving over time, in a sense. So yeah, I've thought about that before, and actually I've gotten that question from people before too, of, the Old West gunfighters, because, those two Civil War generals fought with 6-shot pistols, and it just keeps evolving as well. But a lot of times those Old West fights, like the OK Corral, it wasn't really a duel. They just sort of started shooting when they encountered one another. By the way, on Netflix, there's a great documentary about the OK Corral. If you ever get a chance to see it, it's pretty new. It's good. Yes, sir.
A lot of the gunfighters out west were
ex-soldiers. Yeah.
Like Josie Wales,
Right.
So
Yep.
they took that. They were unemployed soldiers. They took that culture with them.
Right. Exactly. Yes, sir.
Possibility, thinking about everybody shooting everybody, is maybe the Hatfield-McCoy feud in Eastern Kentucky, maybe their version of a long-standing, ongoing dueling type of.
Yeah, and there are a lot of the feuds in Eastern Kentucky too. There were like economic reasons, fighting over timber rights, for example, things like that. Dueling would happen, and again, it was sort of that, in a sense, you've impugned the family honor, because all classes had some sort of honor culture, and there's one line that like eye gouging fights between Tennessee hog drivers was still honor, just as it was Henry Clay's duel. It was still you're defending your reputation, and that's what was sort of paramount for people. And again, like revenge had a lot to do with those two, and kept perpetuating it. So, like the feud stuff is a lot more complicated in a lot of ways, to me at least. Yes, ma'am.
Maybe the decline too is because now we have AC and people just get mad when it's hot.
In fact, the last chapter of my book is titled Air Conditioning, the great equalizer. Yeah, people got a lot. I never thought about that. Yeah, people were just nice, became nicer. But yeah, I do think, I don't know, I think a lot of it was sort of concealed weapons. I mean, again, everybody carried a pistol. And a lot of that was after the Civil War, there's such a prevalence of handguns. These former, so many guns were shipped into Kentucky, for example, that you could go to a drugstore and buy one for, because there's stories of, two men getting in an argument in Lexington. There's one in particular, I can't remember the name of the guys, but one bought like, it was like a long barrel pistol and went out and killed the, guy he had an argument with. So the accessibility of firearms, if you're ever against like a weight for buying guns, I mean, like Kentucky history will probably set you straight, because there are a lot of these sort of, immediately angry, I go buy a pistol, I kill my opponent. That happened quite a bit, unfortunately, in Kentucky. But yes, ma'am.
And I can't tell you where I read it or whatever, but I read an article about a psychology experiment where they were kind of getting college men, young men, or men of varied ages, and kind of testing how quickly they would take an aggressive stance to people. And they talked about how much more quickly Southern young men or men would take a more aggressive, not necessarily cause a fight, but take on a more like, kind of thing than young men or men. I don't even remember the parameters from the age.
Yeah,
very kind of an interesting article.
Very cultural thing that I think lasted for a long time, really. And that's what makes all this stuff so interesting to me. I mean, they're sad stories. I mean, a lot are pretty awful, but it's sort of interesting to see how the violence changed in the state over time.
We have time for one more question. Anyone?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, so we're more civilized now, I guess. Or we don't have, we have laws that take care of these, our honor.
Right. Yeah, and I think, again, culture change, I think that sort of honor culture, after several generations after the Civil War, just sort of went away too. And I think, and again, I think that combined with the legal system, just the idea of carrying a pistol went away. Because there were governors in the 1870s, 1880s who were constantly, trying to tighten up gun laws and failed at every turn because the murder rate was so terrible in Kentucky. There's one Kentucky town that had, one of the highest murder rates per capita in the country at one point. There was a note on that. I think that was 1880s. So it was just pretty bad. I think there was this cultural shift about just the idea of carrying weapons. It got more frowned upon. Also, the penalty for carrying a concealed weapon, which was illegal at the time, was really low. I mean, if you were caught, it may have been $20. And I think they increased those laws too and made it a lot more expensive. So they found ways to sort of deter people from carrying weapons. As fewer sort of concealed weapons, or as the rate of concealed weapons went down, so did the murder rate. But I think there's also, again, that cultural shift. It became almost like a habit of carrying your pistol. Like you leave your house with your keys, your cigarettes, and your pistol was kind of the thing. So, but.
All right.
Thank you all. Really appreciate it. Thanks. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
And